Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am your host, Brian Fleming, and I am here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Tim O'Toole, on this lovely Thursday afternoon. All is right with the world, right in air quotes. How's it going, Tim?
We live on the best of all possible days in the best of all possible worlds.
Hear, hear. Welcome everybody.
How could you face things if that weren't true?
That,
right?
that is entirely true. Welcome everyone back to Embargoed. Great to have you with us again. Not to no one's surprise, after a one episode hiatus from China, we are now basically only going to be talking about China on this episode. We're coming back with a vengeance, given that all that's going on these days with TikTok and WeChat. So for those of you who missed our China takes and our China content, have no fear. That's basically all you're going to hear on this episode. Before we get started, I'll dispense with the normal preliminary comments, which is that we're not giving legal advice. We are not discussing any confidential information. These opinions are solely our own and are subject to change, perhaps, as we are discussing, given sort of the way the winds are blowing or swirling. The chaotic winds are swirling these days all around us. And if you like the pod, of course, please subscribe. Please give us a 5-star rating. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, Overcast, YouTube, wherever you get your content. We appreciate your continued support. We appreciate the comments. I think we definitely had some people that were happy to get no China content the last time and like the kind of grab bag, our all lightning round approach. But we can't. We have to accept who we are as a podcast, which is, if we're committed to dealing with and dissecting what are the most interesting and important issues going on in the world of international trade at the moment, certainly from a U.S. focused perspective, I don't think there's any denying that this one's got to be all China, or mostly China. So with that, any thoughts, Tim, before I give the roadmap and we are off and running here?
Two quick thoughts. The first is, just when we thought we were out, they keep sucking us back in. We've got to go back to China because that's really where a lot of the trade law is happening. I also do think that a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today have an election-related component. So I definitely think that it is that time of year, and so the trade law seems to be often based on kind of how the election is going in a particular state, or how the election is going with respect to a particular community.
Yeah, I think that's been sort of lurking in the background all year since we really started the podcast. And now that we are 6 weeks away, or slightly less than 6 weeks away from Election Day here in the United States, I think there's absolutely no avoiding it. I think there's just about anything that happens these days is tinged with, well, maybe we'll wait and see to what happens after the election, or maybe this will be reversed, 3 months from now or 6 months from now. So I think that is going to be a meaningful just about everything we're talking about here. I agree completely. So the roadmap for today, topic number one, which is, we're calling one topic, but it's really about 8 different topics, is our latest check-in with TikTok and WeChat. And within that, we are going to cover, of course, the prohibitions that were announced last week by the Secretary of Commerce, which were then quickly abandoned or withdrawn sort of over the weekend for a variety of reasons. But nevertheless, we're going to talk about those first. Then we're going to check in on the state of the various of the bans on TikTok and WeChat, and of sort of significant import there is the state of the various litigations that are going on related to that on both sides. Then we're going to check in with what's going on with CFIUS and the state of the TikTok divestiture. I put that in air quotes because it's unclear whether it really is a divestiture. And despite the president indicating that he's good with the deal, I think there's still significant uncertainty as whether it's going to happen and what form it's ultimately going to come in. And then finally, we're going to check in with something that's been sort of brewing for a long time, which is China's Unreliable Entity List. And this is related to the TikTok and WeChat situation. It's really more of a Huawei generated issue. I think that's where this sort of first kicked up and the idea first at least got publicly discussed in China. But just this week, regulations issued by MOFCOM in China laying out the parameters for this unreliable entity list. And so we're gonna hit that last as we discuss the TikTok WeChat situation. So that, again, that's one topic sort of, but it's really like 100 topics all boiled into one. We're then going to move to Iran, and in particular, the U.S. Efforts to try to reimpose UN sanctions against Iran 2 years after it withdrew from the JCPOA, which has not surprisingly caused quite a stir among those within the UN community and elsewhere. And then also new unilateral sanctions that have been imposed by the U.S. relating to arms sales to Iran. And then that's really it for the main portion of the show. I think that is going to be plenty for us to cover. And then in the lightning round, we're going to hit two topics. One is explicitly election related, which is a couple of recent election interference and cyber related designations from OFAC. We're going to touch upon those briefly. And then we're going to talk about the latest just came out yesterday and has just officially been released today, which is new restrictions on Cuba relating to U.S. travel to Cuba, a few general licenses that have been taken away, and a brand new list with respect to Cuba that we will talk about, the CPA list, which they never fail to come up with the catchy acronyms in the sanctions and trade
Leave it
world.
to OFAC.
Yeah, exactly. So, so anyway, that's the show for today, and I think sort of without further delay, we'll just hop right in. So again, topic number one, TikTok and WeChat. So when we left you, we were all awaiting the prohibitions, the scope of the prohibitions from the Secretary of Commerce, because as we discussed a couple of episodes back, the executive orders that were issued in early August targeting TikTok and WeChat for the so-called TikTok and WeChat bans did not define the scope of prohibited transactions. Well, we got those, the scope of those transactions last Friday, September 18th. We're recording on Thursday, the 24th. And so we're going to get into, in a moment, what those did, and probably more significantly, what they did not do. And I think we're going to start there. And then, as I said, we have many other aspects of this to look at. But in terms of what the prohibitions actually did, again, and harkening back to our earlier conversation, where we certainly, upon a first read of the executive order, these prohibitions could have swept incredibly broadly. And I think that was a great fear, and in sort of the global community, certainly in China, that the US was going to try to really take a broad swipe at both TikTok and ByteDance and WeChat and Tencent. What we really is sort of what we were expecting as a sort of first line priority here all along, which is going after the app stores. And the number one thing on both sides of this is the prohibition touches the app stores and the ability to get new downloads and updates of both of these apps. And then essentially everything else is related to infrastructure, whether it be internet service providers or content service providers, relating to the functioning of the app. And with WeChat, all of this was supposed to kick in over the weekend as soon as the 5-day window had closed. And with TikTok, it was going to be phased, because there was going to be the App Store prohibition was going to go in immediately, and then there was going to be the rest of it was going to be deferred until November, because that syncs up with the CFIUS review timeline, and they made clear that if those issues are resolved, then perhaps all of this goes away with respect to TikTok and ByteDance. A couple of quick notes in terms of carve-outs and what is not covered. So what is not covered are employees and payroll and things like that. So this was explicitly sort of carving out employees of the companies, even in the US. Also, existing users of the app engage in personal or business communications. That's not part of the prohibitions. And then there's a whole category that also makes very clear that this is not meant to cover out anything outside the US. If we were going to go through, we're not going to try to recite every single aspect of this because we would, that would be the whole program today, but that in a nutshell is sort of what it all covers. Of course, they sort of warn that this could be expanded at some future date, but essentially it's the app stores and it's all of the infrastructure that's designed to service, support, and make the app function. And as one of the parties has said in court filings, when all of these go into effect, it will essentially bar and ban the app in the United States. So this is at least, that is what the US has said they would do. This is now done, or at least attempted to do in the first instance. So what were your reactions, Tim, with respect to when you first saw the scope of what we got last Friday?
It was not as broad as it could have been, was my first response. It was really as expected in terms of, particularly I'm talking about WeChat now, because I view TikTok as different because that hasn't gone into effect, may never go into effect. I think it's the purpose with the TikTok commerce side rules or commerce side executive order was to really force action in the CFIUS proceeding, and so that worked, and so or appears to have worked. So I'm not sure those are ever really going to go into effect. But with WeChat, I think there was a huge fear that there would be a WeChat ban that would it purport to ban WeChat in China, and that would have been something that would have been just a huge sanction, probably the biggest sanction ever issued. It was much less than that because I think from reading the lawsuit, it appears there's about 19 million WeChat users in the US. So that's still quite a big group of people, but it's nothing like the billion folks in China that rely on WeChat every single day. So I was, but I also I still continue to be astounded by the lack of any criteria in the executive order for the Secretary of Commerce to decide what transactions will be banned. I mean, we guessed this based on media leaks, but otherwise, I mean, it could have been the types of transactions that could have been banned range from the really mundane all the way through to banning the entire use of this hugely important platform in China. And so it did strike me, and it still strikes me as a real example of how broad the president's delegation of authority under IEPA is, and how broadly then the president has continued to construe it. And I don't mean by the president this president. I just think in terms of executive authority, it shows how sweeping that authority has gotten. And I think that at some point that there will be some question about whether it has any bounds, and maybe this is the case for that.
Right, and so I'll just offer one other quick thought that's sort of along those same lines, and then we can kind of move into once I think the term of art that we used originally to describe all of this was a huge mess, and I think that it has continued to get messier and messier. And from last Friday when this was released until today, it has gotten much messier. So we're going to get into all the mess and what it all means in a moment. I would also add that these are unlike what we see in many other contexts, whether from BIS or OFAC or other agencies that are issuing kind of rules like this or interpretations of, delegated authority under executive orders or statutes. There's nothing here. I mean, look, we know how to, if we had to reach out to somebody at the Commerce Department to try to get some guidance on the scope of one of these provisions, and I believe that is going to be happening. Are you an internet service provider for purpose of this? Are you a content network services, delivery entity for purposes of this, et cetera? Those types of questions I think are gonna come up. There's not really, it seems, any kind of regulatory apparatus in place to sort of deal with that. There's certainly nothing that contemplates any kind of licensing or exceptions or anything like that with respect to any of this, as far as I can tell. So
that's already come up for me. So
yeah, for me as well, which is why I bring it up, because it's like, as a practical matter, what are companies? I'm sure many people listening to this are thinking, well, we think maybe we're covered, maybe we're not covered. Can we continue to do this with Tencent on behalf of WeChat in the United States? We don't know. How do we get clarity on that? What do we do? Just very, very fundamental questions.
Well, and one of the things that I've seen so far is that for international travelers, there are often currently requirements that the traveler get and produce the results of a COVID test. And for travelers to China, my understanding is that that's done on WeChat. And so if you're traveling back to China from the United States, how would you do that? And that
Right.
doesn't that seem like the type of thing? I mean, but for the injunction, how would you do that? But
Right.
doesn't that seem the type of thing that that would be licensable, even assuming
Right.
it's covered by the order? If somebody came to me with that question in a normal either Commerce Department scheme or a Treasury Department scheme, we would be starting to think, okay, that might be prohibited, but it certainly seems to be the sort of thing that they would license. I mean, a health use of this app for health purposes, but I don't know how you'd license it because they've banned the whole thing.
Because there is no licensing regime, apparently. This is just,
But what could you do too? I mean, could you give
right.
one person the ability to use WeChat in the United States when none of the servers can host it? I mean, it would be
Right.
difficult to implement a
Right.
licensing regime, although it does seem that example seems like exactly what you would use for that.
Right. I agree completely. I mean, I think as I said, we're not going to get into it today. I'm sure it may come up in the future as these lawsuits and other actions continue to play out a bit more. There are some terms under here that are, arguably quite ambiguous in what is covered, what is not covered. There is really no regulatory framework for how this is really. Then it's a decree about what's prohibited, and that is it. So, how does that play out? Are we going to get regulations on this at some point in the future? I suppose that's possible, but for the time being, this is what we're left with. So, I think this is sort of an initial. Let's just leave it there for now in terms of an initial discussion on this, because I'm certain we will come back to this at some point. And in any event, over the weekend, all of this got thrown out the window because two things happened. Number one, a group of WeChat users won a preliminary injunction in the Northern District of California to stay the effectiveness of the WeChat-related rules and prohibition on First Amendment grounds. And then because of the progress that had been made in the negotiations that CFIUS is overseeing and an apparent deal met with approval by the White House, Commerce basically withdrew its initial order or the scope of the prohibitions going into effect on September 20th with respect to the TikTok side, and said we're going to give an extra week till September 27th in light of the progress that's been made. So basically over the weekend, everything came to a screeching halt because of the court action and because of the progress on the CFIUS front. I would add that in addition, the lawsuit that we talked about previously that had been filed by TikTok and ByteDance, that was originally filed in Los Angeles. That was voluntarily dismissed. There was another lawsuit that was filed, basically the same thing, in DC, in federal district court in DC. That lawsuit is still ongoing. And in fact, I think there was supposed to be a conference with the judge today, because yesterday there was a preliminary injunction motion filed in that case for, I think, exactly the reasons that Tim has alluded to previously, which is this is kind of belt and suspenders in the event that something goes sideways with the CFIUS process and the transaction that's underlying all the concerns. They have the court action potentially to fall back on to, forestall implementation of the order with respect to TikTok. So nothing is currently in effect. So everything we just talked about, all the prohibitions, all of that at the moment is not in effect. And you could go, well, when you listen to this next week, by the time you listen to this next week, that could have changed on Tuesday, September 29th. But at the moment, you could go on to your app store and download both apps and use them freely. And everybody who supports those apps could continue to provide that support without being in violation of these prohibitions. So with respect to the lawsuits, let's talk about that first. What are your thoughts on? So basically, you have the users group who the grounds that they showed a likelihood of success on for purposes of getting their preliminary injunction was First Amendment. And I'm going to turn to Tim to talk about that because he knows a lot more about that than I do. And then in the lawsuit that's going on in DC, they raise essentially the same issues. The same issues are more or less raised in both First Amendment, Administrative Procedures Act, IEPA overstep, but they sort of reordered them. And in the DC lawsuit that TikTok is bringing, IEPA, and in particular, the restrictions on the president's authority with respect to personal communications and informational materials and the ability to regulate those under IEPA, that is kind of the centerpiece and the number one leading argument that they're making in DC, which I think is important and we need to talk about. But let's first talk about the WeChat suit and First Amendment. What did you take from that?
Yeah, and I do want to get to the Berman Amendment stuff because that's also in the WeChat suit, but the judge really didn't reach the issue.
No.
She didn't find a likelihood of success on that issue, but at least the way I read it, she kind of ducked. She's like, I've decided the First Amendment issue.
Definitely not foreclosed, but just not enough on the record, and we could revisit that. Yeah, that's what I took it to mean.
But I mean, I know just enough about the First Amendment to be quite dangerous on this and to get it wildly wrong. But as I understand it, the theory is that because WeChat is used even by the community, the Chinese American community in the United States, as kind of a communications device, a device for organizing, a device to deal with various political matters, that there is quite a bit of protected speech that is being essentially prohibited, although it's not directly prohibited by the president's or by the Commerce Department's order with respect to these transactions. And that in order to do that, the government has to show that their order is narrowly tailored to a compelling government interest. And here, I mean, this thing wasn't narrowly tailored at all in any sense. I mean, it's more narrowly tailored, I guess, than it could have been, but there were no standards that went into it to begin with, and it sweeps really broadly. But I think that the other thing that was really in dispute here, and we talked about it a little bit in previous podcasts from the side of, you have the president saying a lot of things that really undermine the notion that any of the national security justifications are legitimate. So we talked about that on an earlier podcast, and that was part of the lawsuit. But then on the other part of is there a compelling government interest here that is, this is narrowly tailored to? The court really found that the government hadn't stated a particularly compelling or even very cognizable national security interest with respect to WeChat. And to be quite honest, I haven't seen it either. I mean, and so essentially the argument is, the Chinese government is really going after data, and this is a Chinese company that has access to a lot of data, and therefore I have a compelling state interest to do pretty much anything I want. And that didn't seem to survive, strict scrutiny under the First Amendment, even tailored to the national security context, where the court said we'll defer to the president's statement of a national security interest in the first, obviously, because the president has access to a lot more information than we do. But you'd think that if this was really as bad as they're saying, they'd be able to articulate that interest better than they have here with respect to WeChat in particular, and not just with respect to China writ large.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think also, just for any First Amendment nerds out there, this is technically an intermediate scrutiny case because it's content neutral, but it is the same principle. Tim described all the principles correctly. It's just, is it narrowly tailored, government interest? And then the other aspect is, did it leave open adequate channels for communication, right? And I think the court says potentially no on that as well, because they had some declarants and other evidence that got put in that said that this is really the exclusive way that these 19 million users, Chinese users or Chinese American users are communicating with one another. And so it almost, amounts to a form of censorship by just sort of taking this out of, putting this out of commission. So, I mean,
shutting down the town square is really
exactly that was the metaphor that was used. So in any event, I think look, there's going to be a lot more to be said on all that. The government's going to fight this, tooth and nail. Although I would note, at least upon my last check, I don't believe that there's been, as I said, the the TikTok prohibitions were withdrawn over the weekend and then reissued with the new September 27th date. The WeChat prohibitions have not been, at least not upon my last check just before we started recording. And so I wonder whether or not this is enough to make the administration or the Commerce Department think about tinkering with the rule or with the prohibitions in some way to try to satisfy this, or if, as I would not be surprised, they just decide their way is correct and they're just going to fight this tooth and nail, and this magistrate judge in San Francisco is totally off base, and we'll steamroll that person and go all the way up, and we'll get this to stick, kind of thing. But if that's the plan, that could take quite a while to play out, obviously. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any change in tactics with the actual substance of the rules themselves, or if it's just a litigate until we're told by somebody, that this is not going to pass muster. Made all the more difficult by the fact that for the time being we have a 8-person Supreme Court as well. So, that'll be interesting to see. I think on the other side, with respect to TikTok, as I said, the primary, or the at least lead argument that they're making is that the scope of authority here that the president has under IEPA was exceeded because the personal communications and informational materials, of which videos clearly are covered, films and videos are clearly covered, is carved out from IEPA. And this is something that is just beyond the authority of the president to regulate, and has been, that has been the case essentially since the beginning, since IEPA first went on the books, but was made even more clear and expanded through the Berman amendments, as Tim said, in the late 80s. I thought, interestingly, one thing I saw that I thought was interesting was deep buried in the middle of the brief. And it's a very long brief, but for anybody out there who's interested, I would encourage you to read it because it covers a lot of interesting ground, was a whole section that talked about the way that OFAC deals with the Berman amendments and informational materials. And that OFAC clearly acknowledges that this is out of bounds. And so they either explicitly carve it out from any sanctions related authorities that they are administering, or there are general licenses that are put in place to deal with it so that people can still exchange these types of items. And I thought that was interesting. There was like a page or two section in the middle that the TikTok basically put in there as sort of a prime example of how this is just very well established, even within the government, that this is that this type of action is just out of bounds because sphere is one where you just can't meddle.
No, I mean, I definitely think that with respect to the TikTok. With respect to the TikTok lawsuit, the Berman Amendment is going to come front and center, because the First Amendment argument, I think, was much stronger in the WeChat case, whereas which is why I think the judge didn't feel the need to reach the Berman Amendment arguments, although I view them as strong as well. But I think that in the TikTok lawsuit, if it ever gets off the ground, we'll see the Berman Amendment / the president, IEPA does not authorize the president to regulate personal communications of this sort, is a pretty strong argument, and appears to be what's going on here. Now, in both of these cases, I will say that the president's regulatory authority seems strong, but is also undermined by statements that the president has made outside of the context of these administrative proceedings. And so I think there is going to be a big fight, and there, some of those statements made it into the injunction order, and they certainly feature prominently in the briefs. There will be a big fight about how important the president's statements about the purpose of these orders is, because some of those statements strongly suggest that the order was infected by and perhaps motivated by anti-China animus.
Yeah, and in the TikTok lawsuit, they even bring in the point that this is just again, sort of a ploy to curry favor with voters in advance of the election. Essentially, right. That's basically what it boils down to. So, yeah, and as we said, there's many other bases in the TikTok lawsuit as well: First Amendment, APA, some other IEPA related claims. But I do think the sort of personal communications, informational materials, the Berman Amendment related claims are sort of critical to look at, again, because they are so central to the way that any kind of certainly sanctions are imposed and administered just across the board. And as we said, I think the first time we talked about this, IEPA authorities are quite broad. This is one notable area that has been limited and has never really controversial in how it's been limited. So seems to be now sort of bumping up against that pretty squarely, and so how that ends up playing out will be interesting to see. Now, the caveat to that is, as Tim alluded to, on the TikTok side, the lawsuit may end up being mooted relatively soon, quite frankly, because if there is a deal that is struck to restructure TikTok that passes muster with CFIUS in the White House and the Chinese government, we'll get back to that in a minute, then one would imagine that their lawsuit just goes away, and that this is, it's sort of a proactive defensive measure, if you will, in the event that things fall apart in front of CFIUS. The latest there, of course, which is also, again, completely intertwined and making this all it is, late last week, it announced, or it leaked out, that there was a deal on the table to restructure TikTok that would involve Oracle and Walmart taking on minority equity interests in a new entity that would be called TikTok Global. Oracle would be the cloud service provider that would basically hold all the data, and then there were some other details, but that's essentially the crux of it, is that those two, large U.S. companies would be at the center of this, and then over the next several days, and the White House and the president sort of acknowledged that this was something they were viewing positively, and this would get the thumbs up. Over the next several days, there were a number of things that came out that have left everybody sort of wondering where this all really stands. One issue is, as we talked about the first time this came up, was the claims the U.S. Treasury is going to have to get a piece of the action here. And I think the president has now backtracked on that and essentially issued as close to a mea culpa as he will ever issue, saying, well, I didn't realize that we couldn't do it that way. But what apparently is in the deal instead is this idea that there's going to be $5 billion that will go for some sort of education fund, whatever that is, and it appears to be very sort of ill-defined and not very well understood. I believe the ByteDance folks basically said, well, that's news to us. We didn't even know that was in the deal. So that's a big question mark. The other sort of point of contention seems to be how much ownership interest ByteDance is going to retain here, because again, the CFIUS related executive order issued in August was talking really about a divestiture. It does not look like it's going to truly be a divestiture. It looks like it is sort of maybe not a reshuffling of the deck chairs, but there's these two new U.S. investors that are coming in. There's some solution on the data from the U.S. side with Oracle's involvement, and then there is some, it seems, increased role perhaps for the U.S. investors in ByteDance, the existing U.S. investors in ByteDance, to take either board seats or control of the entity. And so, but there seems to be, again, some disagreement as to what exactly the parameters of that are and who's going to be really in control, what the true kind of percentage ownership is going to be of ByteDance going forward if this all gets approved. And so that remains a big question mark. And then the last piece, of course, is that in the middle of all this, the Chinese government inserted themselves and said, you know what, we're imposing new restrictions on exports of certain types of technology out of China, and we are going to have the final say on whether or not we approve of this. And of course, all of the preliminary indications were that they were not going to approve of this because they view it as an insult, and they're furious that one of its crown jewels in ByteDance is being forced to kowtow to the whims of the U.S. administration to save TikTok. And so just the latest report I saw today was that ByteDance has now formally submitted the deal to the Chinese authorities to review and hopefully get approved. But whether that will be approved, what exactly the details are they're reviewing, and if they're the same as the ones that are being reviewed in Washington is a question mark. So again, I think on the whole, we, based on Tim and I discussing this in the past few days, we still think that there's going to be some kind of a deal done here, because there's just too much at stake not to get a deal done. But I don't know. I mean, there's still a lot up in the air. So I don't know that it's a certainty, and I do not know what it's going to look like at the end. Is definitely the case at this point.
Yeah, I still am just gobsmacked by the $5 billion cut. I
Right.
guess when your background is in real estate and you broker a deal, or force a deal to happen, and the deal is worth X number of dollars, you just feel like you should
You,
get
you
your
get your percentage.
your
Yeah.
cut. But we'll see if that's how it works. It looks to me like that's kind of gone away, and now we're left with a deal that is actually um, much less aggressive than I think we would have predicted at the outset. If this deal is what ultimately gets by the U.S. and the Chinese governments, in the sense that the ByteDance will still have a role, obviously, in TikTok, and a pretty big role. I've always thought from a business perspective that seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, TikTok is a very successful company, and the last thing you want to do is destroy its value by essentially locking out the builders of that company. On the other hand, when there are national security issues, you deal with those. And so it does seem like this deal may well have addressed whatever national security concerns were there, while at the same time trying not to kill the golden goose.
Yeah, I think an interesting dynamic here, because of the involvement, quite frankly, of the Chinese government now in this. The reports are that the algorithms and the source code are not going to be transferred to the U.S. And then that is a non-starter for China, and so that's not surprising that is the case. And that is certainly, I don't think, where the U.S. government thought they would be when this all started, when they started down this road. I think they thought they could probably force that. And so in some ways, oddly, this is now maybe the best deal the U.S. could get, and it's not sort of checking all the boxes that they might have thought they could get at the outset, but is somewhere in the middle, which is an odd position for a sort of CFIUS, a CFIUS reviewed or investigated transaction, and would a forced divestiture, essentially. That it's not really going to be a divestiture, and it's not really going to, I think, probably be the home run that they thought it was going to be at the outset. It's going to be kind of the best they could do. I mean, the U.S. data being in the hands of a U.S. company, that's a big deal, obviously. And I think that at the end of the day is probably what makes the difference here, is if they're comfortable with that, a lot of this other stuff sort of, is secondary. And so that may be what is decisive on the U.S. side.
Yeah, I mean, the shakedown worked, but maybe not as much as they thought it would, because when you have a shakedown that is justified by national security, if the parties come to a deal that protects the national security interests while at the same time not giving in entirely to the shakedown, that is probably the best you can do if what you're really trying to do is protect national security.
Yeah. So stay tuned here. I'm sure, again, whether we like it or not, when we come time for the next episode, this is what we will probably be leading with. But before we sort of move on beyond China, I think the last piece, as I mentioned at the outset, is the Unreliable Entity List, which is now a real thing. I read the English language version of the MOFCOM rule earlier today. And so for those who are unaware of this, again, this sort of came up originally around the time that Huawei was first added to the entity list early in 2019. And it's been rumored to be something the Chinese government was putting together and being orchestrated at the highest levels to kind of counterbalance somewhat, and be able to presumably mostly target U.S. companies that to sort of give them some leverage perhaps and restore some balance, and so that the U.S. wasn't the only one sort of picking off Chinese companies with either the SDN list or the entity list. And so this rule, not surprisingly, is very broad, and gives a lot of leeway to the Chinese government to determine what companies, what foreign companies are, essentially endangering national security or not abiding by traditional economic, rules. There's a lot of language in there that, as we've talked about in the past with the Hong Kong national security law, with great breadth gives great discretion and a lot of accountability. And so I think that there's clearly a fear that the same is going to be true here, that they can essentially decide for purely strategic and political reasons to just put whoever they want on the list, and that will potentially restrict this company's ability to invest in China, to import or export from China, and do a number of other things. So what do you make of the unverified list? What do we think the significance is this going to be? Or I'm sorry, not the unverified list, the unreliable entity list. What do we think the significance is going to be? Do we think this is really going to be causing any heartburn among big US or other multinationals? How do we think this all comes down?
Well, we've been predicting this type of thing for a while. I mean, you get into a sanctions type war with China, arms race, with an economy the size of China's. They have the ability to impose sanctions too. And when you get away from kind of an international consensus for like a grounding for sanctions, so nuclear proliferation has been one, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. There are other issues around which the world will coalesce and view as a good enough reason for sanctions. But when you start imposing the sorts of sanctions and the sorts of penalties that the US has done in connection with TikTok and WeChat, you've got to expect that an economy the size of China will say, well, fine, if you want to have just kind of a completely unbounded, whatever transactions the Secretary of Commerce says are prohibited type sanctions regime, we can do the same thing. And I do think that the Chinese economy is big enough, and the U.S. Trade with China is big enough that it does have the ability to inflict some pain on U.S. companies. Whether they decide to do that or not, we'll see. I will. Another thing that I wanted to point out about this, the broad categories that the Commerce Department in China is allowed to put people or put companies onto the unreliable entity list. One of those conditions is that the company is engaging in conduct that, quote, violates normal market transaction principles. It is kind of odd to have a communist country that essentially comes out and says, if you don't play according to the normal market rules, which I think are the normal capitalist market rules, we're going to put you on a list because you're not playing by the rules of the capitalist game. So I did think that the Chinese government, or the communist Chinese government, purporting to act to regulate world capitalism principles was a little bit odd. And then I guess the last thing that I would say about this is that, these lists do have consequences. I mean, and the fact is that you have a lot of these due diligence services and screening services that compile these lists, and they compile them all. But to be on a Chinese government list and to have to deal with the banks and to have to deal with other companies, finding that list and trying to figure out what it means, to the extent the Chinese government starts putting U.S. companies on this list, and it is now a list that is, has the backing of an actual Chinese piece of legislation, I think it could create real problems for U.S. companies outside of China as well, because we've talked about this before. The banks tend to really err on the side of not getting crosswise with anybody in terms of their screening, and so if they see somebody come up on a list, even if that list doesn't necessarily restrict the transaction, the banks could easily decide as just a de-risking matter not to do transactions with companies who get on this list, or at least to make their banking life very hard. So I think this could be a big deal.
Yeah, agree. And I think also one last point is, the way the provisions are written too, in terms of the types of entities that could be added to the unreliable entity list, it certainly seems that those who perhaps assist or seem to assist the US in their efforts to crack down on Chinese companies could be themselves in the crosshairs here. So a couple of the entities that are sort of rumored already to be on the list, it's sort of for those types of, or in the sort of on the short list of potential first additions here are those types of entities that are rumored to have assisted or provided information to the U.S. in efforts to, enforce against Huawei or other entities. So that's another interesting question that we haven't really had to think about too much with, or we have as a practical matter, but I think is going to become even more urgent is sort of what are the consequences of even just complying with US law obligations and how that could get you truly now crosswise with the Chinese government in terms of, and subject you perhaps to greater risk with respect to the unreliable entity list. So that's going to be a difficult calculus for companies to balance as they move forward, as especially as I think the rumors are, and the reporting that I've seen on this is that, not surprisingly, Beijing is going to wait to see what happens in the presidential election probably before they add anybody to this list, depending on the outcome and depending on the tone of whoever's going to be in the White House from 2021 on. That could very well dictate sort of how aggressively they populate this list, or whether they never populate it at all. So, so I think there's a little wait and see in all likelihood that's going to come with this, but this could be coming and could be coming soon, and I think might have some real world consequences that everyone's going to have to deal with. So. With that, I think we are going to, that is a lot of China content.
That is, I think, are we 50 minutes in now?
We're like
at this
45 minutes in and it's all China. So, so for all of you China heads out there, we're glad that we're giving you what you want. For everybody else, we're going to turn to some other topics now for the rest of the show. So with that, let's go to our old number one favorite topic, Iran, and I'm going to turn to Tim to talk about what's going on both at the UN and in Washington with respect to new Iran sanctions.
Thank you, Brian. So let's make this a snappy snapback discussion about Iran. So snapback is a mechanism that was in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal back in 2015, 2016 between the US, the EU, Russia, and Iran that lifted secondary sanctions that the US had imposed on Iran, lifted EU sanctions, and also lifted UN sanctions. But one of the provisions in the JCPOA was that any country the sanctions would snap back, where any country who was a party to the JCPOA could go into the UN and say that there is a violation of the JCPOA, and if the JCPOA was being violated, then the sanctions would go back into effect automatically. And so the US recently, really over the summer in August, went back to the UN to enforce its rights under the JCPOA to invoke snapback. And if you believe the news reports, and I don't have any reason to disbelieve them, after the US withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, Iran has begun to not honor its obligations under the JCPOA, under the theory that if a party pulls out and we're not getting the benefits of this, then we're not bound by the treaty either. And so the US went to the UN, and the countries in the UN basically just laughed. I mean, this is just another instance of kind of, at least from a global perspective, rogue action by the US, where the US withdrew from a treaty 2 years ago in a way that really, I didn't violate any formal provisions of the treaty, but the treaty didn't have a withdrawal, or the agreement did not have a withdrawal provision. And so the notion, I think, that it wasn't at least implicit in this, that none of the parties could unilaterally withdraw after they'd agreed to this agreement, was itself arguably a violation of the treaty, but certainly a withdrawal from the agreement. And so I think the rest of the world community said, you don't have any snapback rights. You forfeited those when you withdrew. The U.S. was not successful at the UN, but instead, earlier this week, President Trump signed an executive order that purported to reimpose unilaterally what were essentially the UN sanctions that had been lifted under the JCPOA. And the main sanction from the UN's perspective was an arms embargo. So essentially, The JCPOA left in place the prohibition or sanctions that involved some arms sales to Iran, but they were basically heavy arms and kind of the more mundane military items, and the dealings with the Iranian military that were earlier prohibited by UN sanctions were lifted by the JCPOA, and they're still lifted because the UN has not snapped back the sanctions at the US request, but the executive order imposes secondary sanctions on those same activities. And so from the US perspective, even transactions with no US nexus that involve dealing with the military of Iran or providing any sorts of arms sales or defense services to the Iranian military, those are now subject to the secondary sanctions under the president's executive order. And so it's essentially unilaterally snapped back those same secondary or same lifted UN sanctions in the guise of US secondary sanctions. We will see how successful that is, because Europe has already declared those new sanctions completely illegal and says that it's not going to honor them. But again, when the U.S. reimposed the lifted secondary sanctions in 2018 from the U.S. side, the rest of the world said that was illegal and they weren't going to honor it, and that was something that the JCPOA didn't contemplate. And 2 years later, those secondary sanctions have been very effective, in my view, particularly at shutting down a lot of the Iranian oil trade. And so, to the extent that this executive order stays in place beyond 2020 and starts to be enforced, the U.S. may have figured out a way to reimpose, to snap back the UN sanctions without actually having the UN do anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another sort of just really bizarre situation that the U.S. has got itself into now. And I think so the way Tim described it is exactly right. We've basically chosen to unilaterally reimpose this essentially this arms embargo, and the arms embargo under the UN has been in place and was set to expire. And so the U.S. went to try to invoke snapback to basically prevent the expiration. So the expiration of the rest of the world and everybody else who's a UN member country is going to be gone as of next month. But we now have this new executive order that's been issued in the US that essentially imposes the same limitations. And the talking points and the statements that are being made by Secretary Pompeo and others are, no, we have invoked snapback. Don't get it twisted. You must abide by all of the prior UN sanctions that were in place that we have now said on our own, contrary to what everybody else believes, are back in effect. And also we have our own unilateral authorities that we've now put in place to sort of honor and implement that. So let's put aside this sort of kind of bizarre reality of the US claiming something has happened when the rest of the world says, no, it hasn't, because that is kind of where we are here. But as a practical matter, as Tim just described, with this new executive order that was issued and the ability of the US to potentially go after anybody who does try to engage in any of these prohibited arms sales or dealings with Iran, is potentially going to be subject to sanctions by the US. And what kind of an uproar we'll see, if anything, it's all going to depend on obviously how aggressively the US wants to impose these. And to give you a small snippet and perhaps to give you an example of the low-hanging fruit end of the spectrum, the very first sanctions that were imposed under the new executive order this week targeted Iran's defense ministry and Nicolas Maduro for having flouted and ignored the arms embargo for the past 2+ years. And now Maduro, who's sanctioned under many different executive orders at this point, is now also sanctioned under this new Iran conventional arms executive order that was passed this week, that was released this week, in addition to these parties in Iran as well. So that's he is obviously one of the favorite punching bags of the US sanctions apparatus. And so adding on this program is probably not saying much, and was an easy, again, sort of low-hanging fruit. Now, if something, and I think the next on the spectrum would be if we see China or Russia complete an arms sale that would potentially be covered by this. That I think is probably the next place we go. The more interesting case will be, what if a French or UK or German entity engages in some kind of arms deal that would potentially be subject to this? Is the U.S. going to come after them and come after them hard? Because then that's where I think we're really going to see this really get interesting, and the tensions kind of just explode here. No pun intended when we're talking about arms. Is if allies of the U.S. are going to disregard this, and the U.S. is going to say, you know what, we're calling your bluff. We're coming after you, and we're gonna come after you government agencies or you private entities in this friendly country, and we're gonna sanction you for what we deem to be, now covered again under our own unilateral or arguably the UN restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, adding another tag to Nicolas Maduro's SDN listing is not a very effective use of, if that's what this program is designed to do,
right.
Then it's going to be a paper tiger. But again, I agree that if the countries around the world that have entered into a deal with Iran to lift at least the lighter arms embargoes, the conventional arms embargo against Iran, if they start honoring that commitment and the U.S. imposes sanctions, it really could be, we will see who wins. But I suspect that with respect to Europe, for sure, that the U.S. sanctions authorities will win that battle if they decide to fight it.
Right. I mean, and it's also important to note, I think Tim alluded to this, the parties that were actually part of the JCPOA, it was the U.S. until we withdrew, although apparently not for purposes of invoking Snapback. It's France, UK, Germany,
Right.
China, Russia.
China, Russia.
So China and Russia, we are pretty confident are not going to are going to regard this executive order as not, they'll use it to blow their nose with. I don't think they're going to be respecting it very, very much at all. The other countries who we obviously have much closer ties with, that's sort of a different question, although the public statements are certainly that they denounce this action and view the US's actions, certainly vis-a-vis the UN, as being completely null and void. So that's going to be where the rubber hits the road here, and we'll see if any of those countries get in the mix here, or if perhaps some other friendly country is going to try to engage in some arms sales with Iran. What the U.S. reaction is going to be.
Well, the other interesting thing, I mean, comes pretty late in the Trump administration, at least the first term, and if there isn't a second term, will this sort of executive order survive? I mean, I can make arguments both ways. I mean, on the one hand, a President Biden would likely be committed to some version of restoration of the JCPOA. On the other hand, it's not clear to me how popular it would be to essentially lift an executive order that imposes an arms embargo on Iran. And so I could see President Biden lifting this. I could also see a President Biden deciding it's not worth a big political fight in order to allow, in order to make it easier to sell arms to the Revolutionary Guard. So I think from a political standpoint, and even from kind of a transition standpoint, if there is a new administration, whether this thing goes away is not particularly clear to me at this point.
Yeah, so Biden's on the record as saying he would intend to return to the nuclear deal, if he is elected. Now, what that means and whether anybody else is going to want the U.S. to be part of the deal is a whole nother question. Iran obviously has come out and said, look, they basically have said, we've been burned by this already. We've been burned by the U.S. What incentive do we have to do anything? We're not going to go back on that we covered over a course of many years leading up to the original deal. So I think there's going to be a lot of complications. It's not like on next February or March, if Biden's in office, that this is all, everyone's going to be sitting around a conference table with masks on in Geneva negotiating, part 2 of the deal or 2.0 of the deal. Like that's just, I don't see that happening. So this is going to
Well,
take a while to play out, even if the will might be there. I think Tim's point is exactly right. There are now things that have been put back in place that are going to be deeply politically unpopular to sort of just, get rid of again. So it's going to be very tough sledding if there's a commitment to try to get back to some kind of a deal.
well, and the thing is that you could see this executive order being lifted as part of a global deal.
Right.
But I think you're exactly right, Brian. The JCPOA in its old form is never coming back. President Biden is not going to have the option to just say, snap his fingers and go, the JCPOA is back on, because from Iran's perspective, and honestly, from the Europeans' perspective, and probably Russia and China, that ship has sailed, and the JCPOA, because of the way the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from it, it has proved to be too weak a deal from the Iranians' perspective. I mean, it was that Iran understandably thinks this was a terrible deal. We honored our end, and you just walked away with no consequences.
Right.
And so, at the very least, I would think that there would need to be a new nuclear deal that was negotiated. Iran certainly would want more concessions, but even if they would settle for the same concessions, at the very least, they would understandably, and I think correctly, insist upon some sort of mechanism to ensure that once you committed to this, you couldn't get out of it simply because you wanted to, because that destroyed a lot of reliance interests, and I think will make everybody very reluctant to come to the table unless there's some sort of enforcement mechanism beyond the snapback, which is what everybody thought, if anybody's going to violate or walk away from this deal, it's going to be Iran.
Right.
But instead, when the US walked away, that was so unthinkable at the time of the deal that there was no mechanism in the agreement to deal with it.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. So again, this is our fortune telling. We have our fortune telling hats on here. I do think it's going to be incredibly difficult to sort of chart what's really next here, even if Biden were to win. So yeah, I agree. So stay tuned, and again, we will see what comes of the unilateral new sanctions from the U.S. We'll call them that rather than reimposition. Yeah, it'll be. I think this will take a little while to play out, but over the next 3 to 6 months, I wouldn't be surprised if we see again something a little more than low-hanging fruit being targeted under the new executive order. So with that, that is our technically a 2-topic episode, even though again that was about a dozen topics within the 2 topics. That wraps up the main portion of the pod for this week. And with that, let's pause for our favorite sound effect. And we're now into the lightning round. Only 2 topics in the lightning round. I will start with a few recent designations that have come under the election interference executive order and sort of some related authorities, the cyber authorities and some of the Ukraine-Russia authorities as well. I think the most interesting of these is, and the reason we sort of wanted to talk about it is, it was actually the day we recorded the last pod, there was some designations that came out that were focused really around a Ukrainian politician, Alexei Derkach, who there's a very sort of famous picture of him with Rudy Giuliani, and the stated reason that he was sanctioned is because he's a Russian agent and was attempting to sow disinformation relating to the US 2020 presidential election, which is of course all really aimed at discrediting Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and their interests and dealings in Ukraine and many of the things that were sort of at the heart of all of the Russia investigation and the impeachment proceedings and all the rest of it. So I think the thing that's interesting that we really wanted to talk about here, and like I said, there have been a few others that have come in the last couple of weeks as well, that are not as directly sort of on point. They are Russian election interference, but they're dealing mostly with actions that are focused and targeted outside the US. So let's just stay on this for the moment. The question or the comment I have is, it's really quite interesting that we have this designation or this, series of designations that are focused on election interference, that are focused on the president's opponent, the Treasury press release is quick to pat itself on the back and say, look, we continue to stand up to Russian interference and do everything within our power to prevent them from meddling in our democratic election process. But by at the same time, there are news reports that have been louder recently that U.S. intelligence agencies generally don't share Russia election interference intelligence with the White House because it makes the president so angry to hear about it. He doesn't want to hear about it. And so the idea that OFAC is at the same time going after somebody like Derkach, who is so closely tied with the president's personal lawyer, I think is very interesting. It also just gets at some general interesting notions about sort of executive power and, sort of and policy prioritization when it comes to sanctions. As we said the last time, there were only 4 programs that haven't had, or I'm sorry, there are only a handful of programs that have not had any action under this administration. I think some of that is due to world events, some of that is due to just policy preferences, and I think this is getting at that a little bit. And it's a bit of an odd circumstance that we're seeing this now. And I guess, a cynical view here is that this is maybe just enough to credibly claim that the US government is doing something about Russian interference, and also perhaps give the administration the ability to say that they're being even-handed because they're going after someone that was trying to discredit the president's opponent. But I don't know. I think this is, I think it just raises a whole bunch of really interesting issues just about, at the end of the day, sort of the fundamentally kind of political of this tool, of the sanctions tool, which, again, national security interests and foreign policy interests at the heart of all this. But at the end of the day, these are decisions that are made by people who have to make judgment calls about who is and is not worthy of sanction. And so, that's just, I don't know that I even have a question, but that's just a few thoughts, a few sort of stream of consciousness thoughts about it that I'll kick over to Tim.
Yeah, I think it's evidence that the deep state is running this country. And that's really all I'll say about it.
Tim,
no, I guess I'll say a little bit.
Please elaborate on that before so after us, and
Well, it is odd that a president who has repeatedly disclaimed Russian interference in the U.S. elections uses his authority through his administrative actors to sanction various Russian actors for interfering in the U.S. election, and interfering in the U.S. election in a way that would undermine his opponent. It doesn't strike me as something that if this decision were personally put to the president would be likely to do. And but this decision was made using his executive authority, likely without his knowledge and or consent. And so it does raise the sort of deep state issues that the administration has complained about in the past. On the other hand, you want to think that when we have a program that's designed to stop foreign interference in U.S. elections, and the national security actors have clear evidence of that, then they can use those authorities to deal with that, even if it turns out that the foreign actors are attempting to interfere on the president's side as opposed to the president's opponent's side. So I do think it raises interesting questions about kind of who acts using the president's authority and how much knowledge and consent of those actions does the president need to have? Because obviously a president, there's thousands of actions taken by the administrative agencies every single day that the president doesn't know about and doesn't consent to, other than in the most completely
for delegated, the delegation of authority.
Right.
Though,
it's the president isn't doing anything, and the president doesn't know about it. Right. And the fact is that happens all the time. But this one is kind of striking in the sense that it does seem to be something that if the president were asked to review this, right, I find it unlikely that the president would agree.
Yeah, and I will just say, I'll just add as a final footnote here, from my time having worked within the interagency process to put forward and to consider and to, you know, make the case for certain designations under certain authorities, it can be a highly politicized process where it more often than not, it is the people at the highest levels who might be putting the brakes on something or saying, well, we need to do, you know, there's timing considerations here, or there's these considerations here, or whatever the case may be. And whether that's National Security Council or, you know, elsewhere in the White House, that is not that uncommon. And it's not, that is not uncommon. That is true of this administration and every other administration I'm aware of. But yeah, to Tim's point, it's interesting that this is one that got through. And you know, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall if the president and Secretary Mnuchin had a conversation about this at some point before or after this was released. What was said there, but I guess we'll never know. So
No,
yeah.
when Mnuchin's book comes out, we'll know.
Yeah, that's true. When Mnuchin's book comes out, and then he is promptly, it comes out that he's being investigated for unauthorized disclosure of classified information, like
Exactly.
John Bolton, then we'll know. But until then, that's not going to happen. So with that, let's put an end to that one, and let's go to our final topic.
Let's move
which is,
in a lightning-like fashion to Cuba.
yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning, Brian, that that OFAC, what was it, yesterday, imposed a new series of restrictions on dealing with the Cuban government and dealing with Cuba, restrictions that apply not only to U.S. persons, but any person subject to U.S. jurisdiction, which includes U.S. owned or controlled companies. And to quickly tick through some of those changes and then talk quickly about what they mean. So OFAC created a Cuba prohibited accommodations list, so a new list that we're going to have to deal with that really applies to it prevents any person subject to U.S. jurisdiction from lodging, paying for lodging, making any reservation for or on behalf of a third party to lodge at any property that the Secretary of State has identified as owned or controlled by the Cuban government. So basically, there's going to be a list of accommodations that you can't stay at if you're a U.S. person, but travel agencies can't make reservations there. And this isn't just U.S. persons; it's persons. It's foreign companies that are owned by U.S. So it's pretty broad, and really designed to crack down on the Cuba hotel industry, the tourist trade, and affect it in a way that is broader than just U.S. tourists and U.S. travel to Cuba, since U.S. tourism is still technically illegal, although there have been rumored to have been trips where people do things that look like tourism, but I'm sure that they were engaging in the generally authorized activities under some of the general licenses. So there also was previously, in kind of the loosening period under the Obama administration, there was an allowance that U.S. persons who went to Cuba lawfully could bring back basically rum and cigars, and the amounts got bigger and bigger under the authorizations. Yesterday's action took those authorizations away, so you can no longer bring into the United States rum and cigars when you come back from Cuba. There was a general license that allowed for professional meetings and conferences in Cuba, allowed you to go there without a license for a professional meeting and conference. That general license has now been revoked, so you can only go for a professional meeting and conference if you get a specific license. You get specific permission from OFAC, and they say they'll review it on a case-by-case basis, which means they're still open to granting one, but you've got to get one before you go. And then there was a general license that allowed to travel by U.S. persons to Cuba for public performances, clinics, workshops, competitions, and exhibitions. The decision yesterday from OFAC limited the scope of that general license, and so the only remaining general license is for participation in athletic competitions in Cuba by amateur or semi-professional athletes or athletic teams. So it's pretty narrow now, was much more broad. So basically, I mean, the upshot of this is that the administration, which has been restricting travel to Cuba quite a bit over the last 3 or 4 years, has really kind of put the brakes on more interactions with Cuba. The other thing that's not on the press release is that they did away with the U-turn exception, which allowed for U.S. dollar transactions that started and ended outside of the United States. That is no longer around as well. And so with respect to that, it will make it much more difficult for any U.S. person who goes to Cuba to, for example, use their bank card, which was possible under the when the term exception was in place.
Yeah, so just quickly, I don't have much to add other than to say that the reasoning and the stated purpose behind all of these new restrictions or the rescinding of these general licenses is to essentially take money out of the pockets of the Cuban government and to cut out revenue that is essentially directly traceable from U.S. persons to the Cuban regime and the Communist Party in Cuba, and that is sort of the stated goal here, is to sort of cut off all of those revenue streams. I would also say that the prohibited accommodations list, the CPA list, is long. There
Yeah,
are
big hotels on it too.
it is 30 pages. You can find this on the State Department website. They're the ones who are going to be the maintainers of the list, and there are hundreds of names on here, and so that's just another sort of screening headache and logistical headache for anybody who has any connection to who is subject to U.S. jurisdiction, has any connection to traveling to Cuba under any circumstances. Now, this needs to be taken into account. All of the Cuba FAQs that deal with any of the 12 categories that are still allowed for travel to Cuba have now been updated to reflect the creation of this list, so that they're reminding everybody that you have to be consulting with that. So just another dimension to sort of further complicate things with respect to any kind of travel to Cuba for persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction.
Now, the one thing that I'll kind of close with on this is we talked about how it may be difficult for President Biden, even if he wanted to opt back into the JCPOA and kind of put us back where we were in 2016. If there is a President Biden, I don't think it will be very hard at all for him to essentially undo all of these changes with respect to the Cuba sanctions. I think that the Cuba sanctions are very unpopular and could be undone kind of with the stroke of a pen, and probably would be. We'd probably go right back to 2016 if Biden were elected in the Cuba realm as opposed to the Iran realm.
Yeah, I think that's notably also, I think we've said this before with China. I don't know that we're going to go back to an Obama era China policy, even if Biden were to win. I think that is definitely the case, that tough on China is here to stay. Tone will change and some of the particulars may change, but I think China is going to continue to be front and center and dealt with in many respects in the same way in 2021, regardless of who's in the White House. I agree completely, though, that with Cuba, we could very well see a complete reversal and go back to something much closer to what we saw at the tail end of the Obama administration.
It would be easy to do, and I also think that if depending upon how the election comes out and what Congress looks like, some of the Cuba legislation could be undone. I mean, I do think we're at the point where, because this has become a much more partisan issue at this stage, whereas I think 20 years ago it was a much more bipartisan support for the Cuba embargo, that there is the possibility that if the Democrats win the election, that some of the Cuba legislation that really ties the president's hands on tourism could be revisited.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. So with that, we will wrap up for today. That's the end of the lightning round. That's the end of the pod. We gave you a lot of China content. We did cover a few other items. I'm proud of us that we managed to not have it be a 100% China episode. We did mention the election many, many times. I think that is probably going to continue for the next few episodes. I think in all likelihood, we are likely going to make an effort to not have a pod be released on election day. We will probably wait. If we have to skip an episode, we will probably wait and record one later in the week after the election happens in early November, so that there will be one released a week after election day. We know everybody will be busy doing and thinking about other things. If you're in the United States, please register to vote. Please don't be afraid to vote by mail, and we would certainly encourage everybody to do that here in the next few weeks.
Yep.
So with that, we're going to wrap up for today. Thanks again for joining us. If you enjoy the pod, please subscribe. Please give us a rating. You can find us anywhere. And until next time, please everybody stay safe and stay sanctions free. Until next time.
Stay sanctions free, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.